Welcome to the Jyotish project. My name is Sachin Sharma, and in this episode, we will explore the lack of scholarship in Jyotish. So let's get right into it. This episode confronts a painful truth. As Jyotishis, many of us are not standing on a strong intellectual or philosophical foundation. The system we inherited is fragmented: sutras without context, techniques without explanation, scriptures quoted without being digested. In this confusion, we've turned to substitutes, and you'll see this quite often in for astrologers, Vedic astrologers, as they call themselves, is very common as we call them ourselves. Is numerology, tarot, face reading, intuitive downloads, and endless healing modalities, tools we hope will fill the void left by our disconnection from Jyotish itself. But these are crutches, not complements. We seek more certifications to feel credible, more spiritual language to feel profound, because deep down we don't trust that Jyotish as we know it is enough. And I've been practicing Jyotish for 12 years now, and I've experienced Jyotishis from various parts of the world, various parts of India. I've experienced this, and now through social media, we can have access to the philosophical outlook of different Jyotishis and how they are processing the information and the knowledge, their orientation towards the subject, and everything is out there for everyone to see. So this is something that I'm not sometimes, because when we are discussing these ideas, it's like, am I being too much? Am I making this up? Am I should I even, because that's the thing about this episode. It was very difficult to sort of I feel for it, I feel strongly for it, I really believe in it, but I didn't know how to arrange it, and from what sort of grounding. Like, am I just uh being worked up about something that is not true? And this episode has been brewing in my heart for the past couple of years. Like, I've always wanted to speak of these things, is what I mean. And so now is the moment. So the truth is, it isn't, not in its current state. It's not enough. The system is broken. Instead of facing this, we hide behind other people's need to believe and their innocence. So a lot of it is people who are non-astrologers, non-jyotishis. They want to believe. They are innocent. They don't know about enough about the subject, and jyotishis know a little bit, and then in their ignorance or whatever, like whichever way, I've been part of the problem. So I'm not speaking from this place of like, oh, I do it right and everyone's doing it wrong. No, I'm completely more than you can know part of the problem. This episode makes the case that what Jyotish truly lacks today is not more predictions, remedies, or feel good language. It lacks scholarship. Without a living philosophy, Jyotish becomes performance. Without clarity of thought, even sacred traditions become superstition. This is not a rejection of Jyotish, it is a call to rebuild it together, to return to its first principles, to reopen the texts, examine the sutras, question our assumptions, and do the hard intellectual work we've been avoiding. This is what it means to honor a tradition, not to worship its fragments, but to restore its wholeness. So that's the effort in this episode. So let's take a brief example of what's been going on in Jyotish, the scholarship that is available. So in the studies in the history of exact sciences in honor of David Pingree, and you'll see why I said honor with this extra emphasis, because it is, I feel, I mean, it's good scholarship. A lot of effort has been put, but it's not honorable for us Jyotishis in any way. And we'll see how. Edited by Yano, Michio Yano. It's a very important name. Kim Lofka, important name. Charles Burnett. Many important names would come up. All the available scholarship. We find a new. We found find a now infamous claim. The idea of a graha as a force that seizes is something that entered Indian astrology only after planetary deities were introduced from Hellenistic sources. And the Graha Shanti rituals were likely invented in response to those imported beliefs. This is given on page 337 of studies in the history of exact sciences in honor of David Pingree. You see how ridiculous that is. This is what happens when we, as practitioners, inheritors of Jyotish, fail to define our own systems, others do it for us. When we neglect rigorous thinking and philosophical clarity, Jyotish becomes fair game for appropriation, reinterpretation, and erasure. This is not simply about academic disagreement, it's about the loss of intellectual sovereignty. If we don't reclaim Jyotish through deep study, honest scholarship, and philosophical grounding, we will continue to be spoken about and not from within the system. Not these are not Jyotishis. David Pingree, Michio, Yano, Kim Lofker, Charles Burnett, they're not Jyotishis. They are not practicing reading birth charts, applying, testing everything. They're not doing that. They are either philologists, mathematicians, linguists, they're academics who are coming from different orientations and working with Jyotish, Shastra, and sort of interpreting it in this way. The idea of Graha as a force of Caesars, the force that seizes comes from outside to Indian astrology, which is a wrong way to put it. There's no such thing as, I mean, you can call it Indian astrology, but it's Jyotish. Imagine someone writing a definitive history of modern medicine, its purpose, philosophy, and practice, without ever studying medicine, without treating a single patient, without engaging with the clinical literature or being trained as a physician. Would you read such a text on medicine, on modern medicine, by someone like that? That's exactly what happened with Jyotish and is happening. Entire academic frameworks have been built by those who never practiced the discipline. It's being called pseudoscience by people who have never experienced it. They reject it outright. They do the same with Ayurveda, they do the same with Vastu. And we are to blame also. We are also breaking the system, and we'll cover how we do that. So, entire academic frameworks have been built by those who have never practiced the discipline, never sat with a chart, never studied the Shastra with a guru, don't know the idea of guru. They've tainted the word guru itself is completely being destroyed and never entered. And we are also at fault. It's not us versus them. It's a certain level of consciousness that does this. It's not. Uh, there's no like. By we, I mean the people who are actually studying the subject, and it has nothing to do with ethnicity, nationality, or anything like that, and never enter the metaphysical worldview from which Jyotish arises. Right? And we'll see all of the points that I'm making. We'll see it. This episode's going to be a bit long, so I hope you have the patience. In anthropology, genuine understanding requires immersion. You live with the people, learn their language, observe their rituals, engage their worldview with humility. But it's not done with Jyotish. The system is dissected from the outside with no contact with practicing Jyotishis, no study of lived experience, and no engagement with the metaphysical foundations. This isn't scholarship, it's cartography. You're charting it without ever setting foot on the land. You're creating a map of a place while never ever having been visited this place. And this happens a lot with yoga. A lot of yoga practitioners, Jyotish, Vedic astrology, Jyotish practitioners in the world have never visited India, have never lived with the vibe, like where does this language and its ideas come from, what's the root of it. And you don't see this with spiritual masters who have prof- gone into profound states of samadhi, nirvikalp, and higher states of consciousness and different kinds of stuff. They visit, they lived in India, they have a guru, they go through the processes and stuff, but that's the yogic part of it. From the Jyotish perspective, there's a disconnection, is my point. A certain kind of like you're just utilizing, commodifying the system without ever actually entering the system fully. And socio-cultural parts, whether you like it or not, is part of the system. It arises, it's an emotion. You need to understand the emotion, what people feel when they use the word guru. Because linguistically, from far away, when you translate the word guru, you can be like, oh, guru is a spiritual teacher, and it's easy. But when you feel the word guru by going and living in a tradition where there is an actual guru, and the way, the reverence, the the way you practice under the guru, the permission seeking of the guru to be able to teach and stuff, it's an emotion, it's heart paced. The system is dissected from the outside with no contact with practicing Jyotishis, no study of lived experience, and no engagement with the metaphysical foundation. This isn't scholarship, it's cartography without ever setting foot on the land. It is just Michio Yano's views rooted in his interpretation and research methodology. And why use the word Michio Yano, name Michio Yano, is because on the scholarship that's available right now in Jyotish is just David Pingree, Michio Yano, and two or three more names. And Michio Yano is used a lot, and David Pingree are used a lot. And Michio Yano is David Pingree's student. Now, Michio Yano is alive, and he is a Japanese scholar. And I don't agree with any of his views, most of his views, though the scholarship is a lot of effort has been placed and a lot of research has been done. But when it comes to Jyotish Shastra and the way it's been interpreted, the way the perception is completely broken. It's someone who doesn't understand Jyotish, who has never experienced the system and probably doesn't even believe in it, like haven't experienced it correctly, probably went to certain Jyotishis, had a bad experience and just be like, oh, they're just making stuff up, and then that probably creates a certain orientation. It's my assumption, of course. There's a lack of philosophy of Jyotish. The Jyotishi more or less does not even know what they're doing when they're studying the powerful ideas and their implications. When they enter the implications, when they enter the world of Jyotish, they don't even know what they're doing. How do I know this? I have been part of the problem. I am the problem. I am speaking from within the discipline. I've heard the discipline deeply. I love it. I'm absolutely possessed, obsessed with Jyotish. And it hurts when you see Jyotish not doing good. So here's the overview. These are the sections we're going to cover. Visiting the question, why not Vedic astrology, which we covered in Jyotish is not Vedic astrology, episode 1 of this philosophy series. Why Jyotish is not Hindu astrology. What is Eurocentrism? We'll cover this again. We covered it in episode 1. The colonial gaze and the loss of context. We're going to get into it once more. David Pingree, Michio Yano, and the externalization of knowledge. We broke it too. This will be an important one because it's not all about externalization and colonialism and post colonialism and all of these things. We are itself now breaking it. So we cannot act like victims that much, though we need to address the issues. We need to take responsibility for what can be done now. Real scholars and real seers, the call for indigenous language and lived epistemology. So these are the 8 sections that we're going to cover. So, revisiting the question, why not Vedic astrology? So, in episode 1, we opened with a simple but powerful claim: Jyotish is not Vedic astrology, right? And it wasn't for provocation, it wasn't just to provoke someone. It was root. There's a certain logic, and I'm not the only one with this opinion. There are many scholars, many thinkers, many Jyotishis who believe that Jyotish is just Jyotish. We need to stop calling it Vedic astrology because it's disorienting the system. We challenge the term not to stir controversy, but to bring attention to language drift that has occurred over the last century. A term like Vedic astrology may sound harmless, even reverent. It even disguises itself as like you're calling it Vedic astrology, so you're placing reverence because Vedas are worthy of reverence. But it conceals a far more troubling reality. It is the linguistic tip of an iceberg. Beneath it lies a deep misreading of Jyotish, shaped not by its original context, but by the assumption of colonial scholarship. Western categorization, outside categorization would also be appropriate, and cultural export to be able to make it exportable, make it understandable. The aim of that first episode was to shake the surface, to point out that words like Vedic, Hindu, and astrology do not simply describe Jyotish, they reshape it, sometimes beyond recognition. The second episode is where we now go deeper. Now we ask who framed Jyotish in this way? What worldview did they bring to it? And how has this framing altered the global and even Indian understanding of this discipline? This is not a conversation about semantics. It's about epistemology, about how knowledge is produced and by whom, how narratives are constructed, and then how it sort of changes the course of entire school of thought and for what purpose. And it is about the structural violence done to Jyotish when it is translated into terms that belong to entirely different metaphysical systems. So in episode 1 we began the course correction. In this episode we trace the source of the deviation. So we'll understand the lack of scholarship, the starved state of Jyotish right now, and why people are just taking certifications, interpretations, and just the better I can predict, the better astrologer I am kind of motivation. And it is Jyotish, in my opinion, is a darshan. It's a darshan shastra. It's like Sankhya, Yoga, Jyotish are like sort of this unified vision. They're not separate disciplines, and it's supposed to be used in this harmonious manner. But because of the lack of scholarship and connections and research and work together, for whatever reasons, some of them we'll discuss now, complex reasons, is is unfortunate. We need to rebuild it in that way. So why Jyotish is also not Vedic Hindu astrology. So this one is a bit interesting also. So to call Jyotish Hindu astrology is to obscure its unique metaphysical structure by forcibly placing it within the modern category of religion. First of all, even if you want to use the word Hinduism, it's not a religion in the Western or the Abrahamic sense. It is something more. And when we study Jyotish, Ayurveda, and different kinds of systems which constitute and yoga and the formulaic sort of methods to get to a certain state of awareness, it's not a religion in the sense that the word religion is used, the socio cultural aspect. A frame that itself is historically and theologically Christian in origin. Religion means I think it comes from the root religio or something like that, and means the path, a path, a way. And in that profound sense, it's beautiful. Religion can be the path, a sort of a, but it has its own implications beyond its root. Word root context, like that sort of essence, its etymological essence, it has something more than that. So it's not a religion in the sense, but the term Hindu itself was not used by the people now labeled as such until well after Muslim and colonial classifications had imposed external identities on the diverse traditions of South Asia. The category Hinduism was retroactively assembled by colonial and reformist efforts in the 18th and 19th centuries in order to mirror Christianity, emphasizing unity, scripture, belief, and theology. Yet, as many have argued, this homogenization erases the plural, decentralized, practice oriented, experience oriented, pratyak shastras, and often competing streams that actually define the lived tradition of India. They are pratyak shastras. Pratyaksh meaning directly experienced. Ayurveda, you have to experience, you have to live with the guru, you have to see, you have to test vata, pitta, kapha when you are holding the heartbeat of the person in your on your fingers, and you're feeling the vata, pitta, kapha thump of the heartbeat. You have to experience it. Same with Jyotish. And this wasn't done. It homogenization erased the plurality, decentralized and practice oriented, pratyaksh oriented, abhyas oriented foundations. So Jyotish rooted in metaphysical revelation, yet branching into darshana systems, subtle internal. Jyotish is rooted in metaphysical revelation, first of all, yet branching into darshana systems, subtle internal arts, medicine and psychology, and various other things that cannot be reduced to category of religion, let alone Hinduism. So Jyotish is psychometaphysics. If you destroy everything and culture re-emerges after a couple of hundred years, how the laws of physics would be, they'll re-emerge the same. The psychometaphysical things spoken of in Jyotish will re-emerge as the same. It belongs more accurately to the shastric and subtle arts and disciplines, vidyas, and of the ancient world, concerned not with worship alone. And worship again is sort of a is not it's bhakti, and bhakti is okay. You can translate as worship for all practical purposes, but it has its own a feeling. It's an emotion. You have to like get into the depth of bhakti to be able to understand it. Though worship is good enough, I believe. But with metaphysics, causality, karma, and the structuring of consciousness through time, that's where it belongs. To bind Jyotish within the term Hindu astrology is to make it legible to the West at the cost of its ontological integrity. It was useful at some point, but it was haphazardly done. for whatever reasons. I don't know whom we cannot blame and go back into the past. I don't believe that's productive in any way. What's productive is to just course correct now and to start seeing Jyotish as Jyotish. Even when you're making a course, if you're writing something, just call it Jyotish and speak of how Vedic astrology and Hindu astrology and Indian astrology are okay. Fine, you can understand it like that, but just first understand what Jyotish itself and what the word means and what the purpose and the scope and the nature of the subject itself discipline is, and then you can call it Vedic astrology. But to begin with Vedic astrology and never encounter wholeheartedly the word Jyotish itself will uh, disorient your practice, the way you're approaching it, the implications, and everything, which we discussed in the previous episode as well. Hinduism is a term which, as many scholars argue, is a colonial construction, an attempt to unify distinct lineages, philosophies, and practices into one religion to make it legible to the West. And even this idea of six philosophies of India and Astika philosophies, Nastic philosophies is also complete nonsense. And probably it would require its own episode. It's also not a good idea. It's not, that's not how it works. These are all like scholarly, like a Western European, probably some sort of academia wanting to like sort of grasp, like make it, turn it into some sort of graspable system. It's too complex and diverse and practice oriented for them. They wouldn't want to practice. They want to intellectualize and speak of it in intelligible ways and intellectualization of it, but it's not a practice oriented scholarship. And it's not, there have been many scholars, Western scholars, Eastern scholars, all kinds of scholars who are practice oriented scholars, and they've done brilliant work. But this has consequences. Calling it Hindu astrology has consequences. When Jyotish is framed as Hindu astrology, it gets reduced to a sectarian belief system. Its universality is lost. Its Sanatana-ness is lost. The idea of Sanatana is lost. Its philosophical coherence is ignored. Its roots in metaphysics, ontology, and cosmology are overshadowed by ritualism, which is, again, a wrong way to put it. The word ritual is a very shallow way of saying like the complexity of what happens in sadhana and a certain practice is not just a mere ritual. So the word ritual is also something that I have issues with. I'm sorry, but it's just me. Morality tales and cultural identity politics. That's not what Jyotish is about. And worse, it invites critique from both sides. From the secular academy, it is dismissed as religious superstition. Jyotish has become religious superstition by the secular academia. And from the spiritual seekers, it is consumed as cultural symbolism or worship or fear-oriented worship, superstitious worship, and all these upais, all these weird things that people do. Neither sees Jyotish for what it actually is, a discipline of understanding the psycho metaphysical structure of our ongoing experience of reality on earth, rooted in observation, logic, and particular view of consciousness unfolding in time. And Professor K.N. Rao is such a genius. Professor K.N. Rao did not support Karmakand, and he got a lot of heat for saying that. And he also says Jyotish is a pratyak shastra which connects the para and apara vidya. So let's be precise. Jyotish is not a religion, it is not a theology, it is not Hindu in the way that the term is now used. It is a method of knowing, a vidya, a luminous language for mapping the interplay between karma and perception, relationship of space consciousness with space time. Space time meaning kal. The word kal, which we use, which is translated as time, is literally space time. If you go into its etymology and think about it for like 160 seconds, you'll understand kal directly translates to space time, because it deals with, the etymology deals with the idea of measurement, measured space. What is Eurocentrism? Eurocentrism is not just a bias; it is a structure of knowledge. It's how knowledge is structured, how it's perceived, approached, and categorized. It is a tendency, often unconscious, but often also quite conscious, on the contrary, but sometimes even unconscious. And I'll show you one unconscious example to see Europe or the modern West as the origin, center, and measure of all meaningful thought. And you'll see this with Stoics, Stoicism, and all the books on Stoicism that the world is consuming. It's good. I love it. I read Marcus Aurelius's meditations and stuff like completely. It's a beautiful book, but yoga philosophy, Jaina philosophy, Darshana are just like, I don't think Stoicism can match the Stoicism and the precision and the amount of literature, Stoic literature there is in India. It's quite a stoic people, quite a stoic country. India is. In academic, though, I wouldn't want to appropriate it by calling it stoic because it comes from the word stoa and the whole Greek idea and stuff. No, we it's the the austere nature is just part and parcel of yama niyama and the whole idea here. The whole philosophical presupposition, the grounding from which you even begin your sadhana is quite austere. It in academic context, it takes the form of methodological dominance. Western categories, concepts, and systems of validation, how I just call Indian system stoic. Western categories, concepts, and systems of validation are used to evaluate and often invalidate non-Western knowledge traditions. In simple terms, if something doesn't look like Western science, Western philosophy, or Western religion, it's often treated as inferior, superstitious, or derivative. And it's so true. Like if you read these people, even David Pingree, we take his example, Michio Yano, that's what's happening there. Eurocentrism shows up in Jyotish scholarship in predictable ways by prioritizing historical origin over philosophical meaning, by reducing psychometaphysical systems to calendars, rituals, and folk belief. It's just folk belief, primitive folk belief. There's no uh, complexity, nuance. They weren't like, there was no sort of sophistication in their ideas, the way they constructed their ideas and what they were doing with that. None of that is contemplated. By categorizing sacred knowledge as pre scientific, mythic, or borrowed from Hellenistic or Babylonian sources, it's so common. This whole idea of it comes from Hellenistic, Babylonian sources, absolutely ridiculous and flawed. And most importantly, by ignoring the experiential, contemplative, and yogic basis of the tradition in favor of contextual transmission and astronomy based comparisons. This basic idea of what happens in Eurocentrism. So, this bias is not always malicious, but is always distorting. It is what allows a scholar to look at sophisticated system of metaphysical psychology and call it primitive astronomy. Oh, they were geocentric models because okay, if their models were geocentric, ours weren't, but they believe the entire world's idea was geocentric. We were never geocentric. We use geocentrism as a metaphysical need in Jyotish because the local space from which you're observing and the context is subjective. Is your consciousness, and your consciousness in this local space, its relationship to space time. So that's why a geocentric model is taken. But sun is the center of the solar system of Surya Mandal is more than understood, and understood in a very sophisticated manner even. It is what allows Rahu and Ketu, two of the most philosophically rich concepts in Jyotish, to be dismissed as shadow planets invented in response to foreign influence. That's what they believe in David Pingree, Michio Yano. It is what frames Indian traditions as imitators rather than initiators of deep systems of thought. And perhaps most dangerously, Eurocentrism does not see itself. It's blind to itself. It wears the mask of neutrality, objectivity, and academic rigor. But beneath that mask is a very specific worldview, one that privileges linear time, material causality, intellectual abstraction over lived experience, subtle perception, and inner transformation. To name Eurocentrism is not to be reactive, which I sometimes feel, am I being too reactive? Is this not needed? It is. I feel it is. It is to begin reclaiming our right to speak from within the tradition rather than always being spoken about from the outside. And I completely am on board with people who don't believe in astrology. I actually like non believers of astrology more than the believers, because believers don't know what they're believing in. Non believers have a chance of being shown facts and experience and stuff like that. They can experience it. Now, the believer is already filled with their own delusions. So when people, uh, including myself, sometimes approach a subject with so many ideas that I have of the subject before I enter the subject, I will color the subject with my own perceptions, preconceived notions, and it distorts your understanding. Non-believers are skeptical, and when they and they should be, because it's a quite a profound and a powerful uh, proposition. What the claims of Jyotish, what it proposes is very otherworldly, to say the least, supernatural, to say the least, for a mundane interpretation of it, for a generic uh, non-astrology person. And yeah, so it's okay. I'm completely on board with people who don't want to believe in Jyotish. So that's just a little excursive, just a little tangent I went there on. So these scholars study Jyotish from the outside as historians, philologists, and Sanskritists, not as practitioners or inheritors of the tradition. Their work is valuable in some sense because it's someone organized, someone did it, so we could probably give them that much credit. But it hasn't done, net effect has been a little bit, I don't know, neutral, maybe a little negative. Maybe there's positivity because now we can criticize it. We have all the things organized in some sense, so we can like read all the names and numbers and stuff, like whatever is given. The work is valuable but limited by the lens through which it was conducted. So these two names are very important: David Pingree and Michio Yano, Harvard trained historian who traced Hellenistic origins of Jyotish. So according to David Pingree, the origins of Jyotish are Hellenistic, are European. His work systematically reduced the metaphysical and soteriological dimension of the system, reinterpreting it as a transmission of Greek scientific ideas into India. And Michio Yano, his student, Japanese scholar of Sanskrit astronomical texts known for detailed philological and calendrical studies, he does not engage with the lived or philosophical dimensions of Jyotish. He has not experienced Jyotish. He does not know what he's talking about, in my humble opinion. He's a senior man. He is a scholar with a lot of experience. He probably knows so much more than me, 100%. When it comes to Jyotish, I don't. He's out of his depth. Like I can it's it doesn't have the context to judge it, because some things are tacit and implied in the philosophical, in the realization of that thing. Some things are implied. So a simple example could be if a profound linguistic text, let's say Nighantu of Yaska, of some sort of linguistic text from 800 BC, and it appears in 800 BC, 700 BC, it's implied that it didn't arise spontaneously without any context or history. Obviously there has to be about 100, 200 years of history. So obviously you immediately can see, okay, from a thousand, at least from 1000 BCE, things were moving in a certain direction for intelligence to reach to that point. So some ideas are implied. So when you study Jyotish and experience it and see for what it's talking about, it's not always about this text says this and none of the other text says this. So this is a known, nothing else can be true. There's no implied uh, meaning, no tacit sort of thing that this means only what it says it means. Another name important, Kim Lofker, very genius scholar, a historian of Indian mathematics and astronomy. She does not view Jyotish as religious or mystical, but acknowledges it as a highly developed computational and observational science. She affirms India's originality in developing the decimal system and sees Jyotish as a shastric vidyā, while also challenging colonial erasure of India's intellectual contributions. And she does not agree with David Pingree's delusions. So she is clear, but on a stance that there is no evidence. She clearly says that there is no evidence of any Babylonian influence on Indian mathematics, any Greek influence on Indian mathematics. Then there's another important name, Yukio Ohashi. He also strongly disagrees with this whole Mesopotamian, Babylonian origins and stuff. He is on board with Kim Lofker. None of these scholars were Jyotishis, though. They approach Jyotish as an object of study, not as a living system of knowledge. Their insights are informative, but they cannot define the inner logic. You see, that's what I mean by implied. There's some things that are implied. Like if we date Mahabharata, there are many things that that conclusion would lead to. They don't do that. David Pingree does not do that. They don't do that when they're studying Parashara Hora. When he speaks about Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra in his book, David Pingree, he none of it is like, okay, this, so oh, if this is true, then this means that. They don't do that. They just see it like they just keep repeating this idea that, oh, this is also Greek, or probably it came in 800, 500 AD, probably this came in 700 AD. This is a fundamental problem. Now, it's important why Michio Yano is a very important name, because when you look at these texts, these big books like the Blackwell Companion of Hinduism, when they are speaking of many things about Hinduism, the part that is given about Jyotish and astronomy and astrology of India and stuff, Michio would be used. So he is an authority. He has been directing the entire narrative in the scholarly world, in the scholar like academic world, about what Jyotish Shastra is about, its origins and everything. So that's why the lack of scholarship is that there are only 3 or 4 names, maybe 7, within their team, all connected. Uh, I think David Pingree is from Brown University or something, or Harvard, one of these. Maybe he's from Brown University. I'm not sure. The point is, I mean, I did my research, but it's not. I can't remember exactly. But that's not the point. The point is that they are directing the narrative. And even in the Blackwell Companion of Hinduism, it says in his essay, Michio explains way in which the science of heavenly bodies. First of all, it is not a science of heavenly bodies. What heavenly bodies? Science of heaven? No, what is Jyotish? That's the first video on this channel. That's what Jyotish is. Jyotish is not has nothing to do with heavenly bodies. It's about Jyoti. And has a very ontological, sort of a very deep metaphysical implication why the term Jyoti is used exactly. How the Indians adopted the Greek zodiac, and how this science relates to the measurement of time, shifting from language, mathematics, and the cosmos to the body. So Dominic Vujastik, uh, I don't know how to pronounce that, takes up the inquiry, showing how an early science of medicine developed in India, a science that is still practiced today. The Michio bit is important here. And you see how unconscious the bias is. When you look at the Blackwell Companion of Hinduism, you see this image. But when you see Buddhism, you see a meditation posture. When you say Islamic thought, you see this beautiful modern background architecture and this beautiful uh, um, architecture of a mosque. In Judaism, you see this. In Christianity, you see this. But in Hinduism, you're seeing people like this. There's no meditation. There's no like Ayurveda. Like the sophistic and all of these systems have interacted with Hinduism in some profound way, with yogic ideas, and some, including if you look at Sufis and their interaction with and with India in yoga and stuff. If you look at Buddha, the amount of Sankhya, the amount of stuff that is used from the, like we see Buddha as part of our system. We don't see it as a separate system. We see as Maharishi Gautam. In Judaism, all of these things. But in Hinduism, you see this image. And this is an unconsciously placed image, because a lot of things in this particular companion, this encyclopedia, I agree with. A lot of things are good. Like they speak about colonialism, they speak about all the issues that it has caused to Hinduism. There are a lot of good stuff. But when it comes to the Jyotish bit, you see Michio Yano's descriptions. And even on Wikipedia, if you read Hindu astrology, Jyotish Shastra, and any of these pages, and you go to all the references and footnotes and stuff, it's all Michio Yano, David Pingree, and all of these names that we'll discuss in this episode. So this had to be a dhyana, and the fundamental philosophical presupposition of all Indian systems is union with something beyond the body mind, or accessing subtler states of mind or consciousness, or whatever you want to call it. This is not it. This is just one part of the practice. Imagine for Buddhism, you use an altar uh, from a temple where there's, you know how if you have been to a temple, they put choco pie and all of these chips and all fast foods and stuff as offering. Imagine using that as a picture, or for a certain images used for Islamic thought, contemporary Islamic thought, or for Judaism, or for Christianity. And there can be images which could, but here we see images which are like this, and then for Hinduism, it's that. Hinduism is dhyana. Buddha used jhanna, Zen, which became Zen, which became Chan. Dhyana comes from this, like, so yogic ideas of yoking and metaphysics of all sorts comes from this. So this is, I believe, not, this is the unconscious bias that I'm speaking of. It's a photographer, probably a European photographer, and clicking this image, probably this is in Banaras, in Kashi. So that's the thing, right? Like, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm overreacting, but I hope we're on the same page and you can see like what I'm pointing at. So the colonial gaze and the loss of context. So colonialism was not just political; it was epistemic. It organized the knowledge a certain way. It caused a certain ripples into how knowledge is understood, received, and categorized and worked upon. It didn't just conquer land and wealth; it colonized categories of thought. It uprooted traditional knowledge systems from their internal logic and replanted them in Western frameworks. And this happened a lot. And many European philosophers are Sanskritists, and you'll be surprised. You can just do your research, and you'll find out like many of the famous big names from the 17th, 18th, 19th philosophical schools of the West are all Sanskritists, where they could be catalogued, measured, and very often dismissed. This colonial gaze did not ask what does Jyotish mean to those who practice it. It asks where did it come from and which foreign influence shapes it. Because of course it has to. It's the assumption is a foreign influence shaped it. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Sanskrit manuscripts were extracted from India, taken to European libraries, and analyzed by scholars trained not in Dharma, Shruti, or Yoga, but in philology, which too was developed via Sanskrit literature, for instance, of Yaska's work and different kinds of linguistic works. Grammarians were Philosophy of Grammarians, Volume 5, Encyclopedia of Indian Philosophy, is absolutely mind blowing. Comparative linguistics and Greco Roman history. The result was predictable. Jyotish was reinterpreted through the lens of Hellenistic astrology, Babylonian astronomy, and linear historiography. So narratives were built, and Jyotish was sort of reduced to this fringe philosophy, not even a darshan. It's just this ritual calendar making. They need to make sacrifices of different things. Firstly, the word sacrifice is the wrong word. Yagya is not a sacrifice. It's a very profound word. It has its own implications on all levels, whether internal yajna or our external karmakan yajna. Uh, it's a very profound word. It's not sacrifice in the Western sense of like, or Abrahamic sense of like. And yeah, so it's that's how they saw it. Jyotish's rituals, calendars, and sacrifice and things like that. It's not. It's absolutely not. Suddenly the question was, it's the most sophisticated psychoanalytic tool you'll ever encounter. It's absolutely mind-blowing. Suddenly the question was no longer how does the system map consciousness, but when did India learn to divide the zodiac into 12 signs, and who taught them how? This is the lens through which scholars like David Pingree reconstructed Jyotish as a textual tradition of borrowed knowledge, disconnected from sadhana, metaphysics, and lived experience. In his view, Indian astrology was essentially Hellenistic astrology in Sanskrit clothing. He actually uses the word like Hinduization of or Sanskritization of Hellenistic astrology, Greek astrology, Babylon. Concepts like Rashis, Grahas, Dashas were seen as imports, mistranslations, adaptations, or distortions of Greek originals. But this method, isolating fragments, tracing influences, and stripping meaning from usage, creates a map with no terrain. When knowledge is studied only through transmission lines, its function, purpose, and power is lost. The context collapses. Jyotish, one of the most intricate psychometaphysical disciplines in the world, gets reduced to a timeline of cultural borrowings and celestial math. This is the violence of the colonial gaze, not that it looks, but that it refuses to see. It looks, it comes here, it takes the texts, it still does it. Modern astrologers with the colonial gaze do it. They look, but they refuse to see it. They don't want to engage in. They'll be studying Jyotish, but they'll be using the ways to interpret are not grounded in Sanskrit, the internal language of Jyotish. They'll be using the word Mars. They'll be applying Jyotish, but doing etymology for the word Mars, god of war, not Kuja, not the thousands of names we have for Mangal, Kuja, this, that. There's so many names. Angiras, I think one of them. None of those names, but Mars will be used. But they're studying Jyotish because it's become Vedic astrology. So astrology word gets invoked. So Mars, Venus, and stuff can be used. It's okay. We can use it, but after having understood the roots. I use the word Venus. I use the word Saturn. They are also profound. They have their Latin origins, Greek origins. They're also profound, but but you're practicing Jyotish, and it has its own internal grammar, its own ways of understanding, own structures. So now again, David Pingree, Michio, Yano, and the externalization of knowledge. If there is one name that dominates modern academic discourse of Indian astrology, it is David Pingree. It's and we'll see which particular text does that. It's the most cited text. His work is often cited as the most comprehensive effort to trace the historical development of Jyotish Shastra. It is actually. It's quite uh, deeply researched but poorly understood. Deeply researched in the sense like everything has been accessed and organized. He went through probably all the manuscripts, but he didn't understand what he's reading. Good cataloging was done very well. Well cataloged, poorly understood. And in one sense, it is Pingree cataloged an enormous number of texts, drew connections between Greek, Babylonian, Persian, and Indian systems, and created a framework for understanding the transmission of astral sciences across cultures. But the framework is deeply flawed because it is not rooted in understanding but in extraction, excavation, and narrative building rooted in a certain bias, which is this is not from India. To Pingree, Jyotish was not a metaphysical system born of yogic insight and Shruti. That's the epistemology, but a Hellenistic construct, awkwardly translated into Sanskrit and integrated into Indian cosmology for calendrical purposes. His central thesis, repeated across volumes, is that most of Indian astrology derives from Yavana Jataka. That's his main idea. He loves Yavana Jataka. He wrote an entire text translating and interpreting Yavana Jataka and other Greco Roman sources. For this angle, concepts like Graha, Dasha, Bhav, and even Karma become historical curiosities, not experiential truths. His student, Michio Yano, continued this tradition, focusing on text translations and commentaries without ever entering the worldview these texts belong to. This is the book. This is the text, A History of Indian Literature. He was given I think this was volume 4 of the History of Indian Literature series. And Astral and Mathematical Literature, Jyotish Shastra, David Pingree. And I think this was edited by Jan Gonda. That's also a very important name in the scholars who come with a certain worldview and a lack of understanding of what we are speaking of when we are accessing these literature, Sanskrit literature. Key characteristics of Pingree school of thought, the only scholarship on Jyotish, is emphasis on textual transmission over philosophical context, prioritizes Hellenistic and Babylonian origins for many astral ideas, many subtle ideas, metaphysical ideas, views Indian Jyotish more as derivative mathematical astronomy than a metaphysical experiential science. It's not. And Kim Lofker is one of the genius scholars, a mathematician, a Ganit scholar, and of South Asian, all mathematical things of ancient world. And she completely says this is not true. There's no proof for this. Views Indian Jyotish more as derivative mathematical astronomy than a metaphysical experiential science discipline, more accurately, but it's okay. Science can be used, though it evokes a lot of resistance in people for valid reasons, I believe. We are doing pretty a shoddy job at giving it the status of a science, so it's okay. I completely understand if people get uh, agitated when the word science is used for Jyotish. Uh, Rarely engages with the lived traditions or the spiritual dimensions of Jyotish, frames Indian innovations as modifications of already imported knowledge. This is the basic fundamental ideas that they work with in this entire text. Yano, like Pingree, writes about the structure of Indian astronomy without engaging with its ontology, psychology, or philosophical depth. The lens is always outside looking in. For example, I'll give you a simple example. If the idea of Sarv Atmacha Divanath, that sun Divanath is Atman, Sarv Atman. The word Atman evokes a whole new idea, all the literature that needs to be accessed. This is not Babylonian Hellenistic in any way. If the idea of gun, every graha is associated with a certain gun, which is Rajas, Sattva, Tamas, and Rajas, immediately you have to make connections to all the literature that speaks of the gunas. Everything Jyotish is the eye, right? It's not, it's a darshan which works with anything else. Jyotish is compatible with every philosophy. That's what makes Sanatan, makes it a sort of this really profound principle that can speak to any other system of thought without being feeling at odds with it. It'll just make your vision of that which what you're seeing clear. It's just sight. It's just clearer sight into whatever you want to look at. Whether you want to look at Buddha's teachings, Patanjali's teachings, any philosophical ideas, metaphysical ideas, anything you're reading, financial world, any, it just makes your sight clear. Not that it's easy, but that's what it does. In the studies in the history of the exact sciences in honor of David Pingree, and that's why I say the word honor like this, edited by Yano, Kim Lofker, Charles Burnett, we find a new, now infamous claim, which this is the claim that we started the video with. The idea of a graha as a force that seizes is something that entered Indian astrology only after planetary deities were introduced from Hellenistic sources. And the graha shanti rituals were likely invented in response to these imported beliefs. You see how absurd, like this is not, you, I don't even need to say anything. This is a staggering assertion. It suggests that one of the most foundational metaphysical ideas in Jyotish, the seizure of consciousness by grahas, is not native to the tradition at all. That is, that it was fabricated post contact with the Yavanas, with the Greeks. What's more alarming is not just the claim, but the tone of authority with which it's made. It, even Michio says there's no doubt. We can absolutely conclude. That's the kind of words he uses if you read his works. In the absence of any engagement with the lived practice, Shastric commentary, yogic insight that animate the tradition. This is the pattern across Eurocentric scholarship, outside gaze. Read the text, ignore the ritual, though ritual is the wrong word. Trace the source, discard the function. Analyze the content, dismiss the consciousness that is analyzing it, and the level of consciousness you require to analyze and see through it. Because that's another thing. It's a thing that to understand. Like if you read chapters of Patanjali Yoga Sutras, most of it will go over your head, our head, my head. Chapter 3, because you need to reach a certain stage in your practice for that sutra to make sense. Even some yama, yeah, you can understand yamas and niyamas because that's the effort a lot of us are making. But other than that, you'd be like, okay, the dharana is okay, then dhyana, entering dhyana, we've never sort of entered true dhyan for a long period. And samadhi is like beyond, like it's only, you actually become a proper teacher, proper yogi once you start entering different states of samadhis. So you need a certain level of consciousness, a certain orientation, certain preparation, philosophical depth, maturity to access Jyotish properly. And a lot of my struggle over these 12 years has been just to prepare myself to even like be able to access some of this understanding in the right way. Because so much mistakes are made for the first 5 or 6 years. David Pingree's interpretation of Jyotish Shastra and a history of Indian literature reveals several significant methodological and philosophical issues. Some of them I've pointed out. I've pointed out six of them. Overemphasis on foreign influence. His basic idea is that core elements of Indian astrology are Greco Babylonian, Hellenistic, which we've said. He says they come in 2nd century AD through Yavaneshwara, through this Fuji Dhwaja, this guy called Fuji Dhwaja, who wrote Yavana Jataka. And this is not true. Neglect of indigenous philosophical frameworks. Pingree fails to acknowledge the deep metaphysical and psycho-spiritual foundations of Jyotish, rooted in Shruti, Smriti, and all of these things. He doesn't understand these contexts within which Jyotish arises, its connection to Ayurveda and all of these things. Because for them, if it's not written, it's not there. They didn't understand it. If they didn't write it somewhere, which we did, some of it maybe wasn't written. If it's not written clearly, it's not, they didn't understand it. They don't understand that a lot of it is lived practice. Reduction of graha concept, which we just discussed. Use of terms like Hinduization, he uses that. Pingree repeatedly used the term Hinduized to describe how Indian thinkers supposedly modified Greek ideas, which reinforces a view of Indian intellectual tradition as derivative, adaptive, and reactive rather than originary, contemplative, or creative. Exclusion of living traditions. He doesn't get into any living traditions. He doesn't see how that could be possible. Conflation of astronomy. He doesn't understand the idea of sadhana and experiential pratyaksha sort of yogic sort of ideas and stuff like that. Conflation of astronomy with Jyotish. The work conflates Jyotish Shastra with mathematical astronomy and treats it like a sub-discipline of the science. It doesn't see that Jyotish has, he understands this. He clearly states that Jyotish has Samhita, Hora, Ganita, and all of these parts. But while in his methodology, he doesn't see that there's an ecosystem from which Jyotish originates. There's a Sankhya efforts, yoga efforts, Ayurveda, Dharma Shastra, Bhagavad Gita. All of these sort of are, they're not like separate schools of thoughts warring against each other. Buddha, Maharishi Gautama himself had a Vaidya uh, who was using Ayurveda. He wasn't using any, he was using Ayurveda to help Buddha and various sort of people in the Sanghas and stuff. So these are not like separate ideas, but Ayurveda is seen as Hindu. So Buddhists would now, in the modern sort of socio-cultural religious context, would say, oh, Ayurveda is Hindu. You see how the distortion plays out and how these sort of categorizations happen. Sankhya Yoga and Sankhya and Advaita, people start warring against each other. And this, a lot of it also happened over the last 1000, 1500 years. And a distortion was made, maybe because uh, realized teachers weren't there. So if you, anyone with realization who's living on earth right now of some profound self, some higher states of realization, doesn't do this. They see a unified idea in all of these ideas and they're just looking at the same idea from different angles. That's a different discussion altogether. A lack of emic perspective. Nowhere does Pingree attempt to understand a tradition from within its own worldview. His work reads like a cartography of a foreign land, mapped without walking its terrain. In anthropology, such a method would be considered shallow at best, blasphemous at its worst. So here are some in the Blackwell Companion to Hinduism. This chapter is written by Michio Yano. He writes, it's very interesting. He writes Rahu and the comet. It's an interesting idea, but he says notion of weekday was just introduced into India at a certain point. In order to settle this puzzle, we must hypothesize either that Chinese translators got some new information directly from the West, or that this passage was inserted in a somewhat later period. Fails to consider that India may have arrived at the 7 day planetary week independently or through its own esoteric logic. Graha rulership and Hora lord sequencing, and how like how we n- scholars like Pingree, Yano, etc. often ignore the internal metaphysical, liturgical, and calendrical development of Jyotish in favor of Greco-Babylonian transmission models. So this is one idea, and this is why it's important because Michio Yano has been directing the narrative for Jyotish, David Pingree, Michio Yano, and all these people. Because whenever a companion of Hinduism to Hinduism or like an encyclopedia of something is, these are the scholars that are reached out, approached for like writing a section. They are cited. So that's why there's a lack of scholarship in Jyotish. The Blackwell, again, in three passages, he writes, so in Shushruta Samhita, he writes that, so the idea is that Greek word hora, which denotes a spatial unit of half a zodiacal sign, a temporal unit of 20 parts. He said in Sanskrit texts on astrology, this word became one of the basic technical terms. So the idea is they're saying that hora word does not come from Ahoratra given in our Vedas. It comes from Greeks. Not that Rig Veda is, because they first date Rig Veda to a very like 300 BC, 400 BC. They would do things like that. And then they would say that the Indians got these ideas from the Greeks. While if you actually revise the efforts that are being made now to date these texts properly, I'm pretty, maybe I'm wrong, of course, I'm not a scholar, but I'm pretty sure still, in my ignorance, that the word Hora actually in Greek comes from India. And then there's this whole idea of Proto-Indo-European, this hypothetical language created to sort of, it's a postmodern sort of idea to equalize so that no language becomes a dominant thing, that everything came from what. So they said like all these languages probably came from a common source, so we can work on this equal footing. There's a Marxist methodology in sort of equalization, that it cannot come from Sanskrit, cannot come from Latin. None of them are dominant. It's a Proto-Indo-European, and that's the methods used. And there are like methods they use, sophisticated methods, and they've made it very sort of they make it so complicated that an average person cannot reach their words in an easy way. And it's a it's not a fact, but they use it like a foundational fact, Proto-Indo-European languages. And then they build all of their theories from that and see them as factually true, and speak of them with like surety, not like, oh, it's based on this hypothesis, so it may or may not be the case. They're like, no, this is the hypothesis, this is true. It's a hypothetical language that we've created through some sort of method, and we create these root words which are probably the root word of all these other languages like Latin, Sanskrit, and all these Indo-European languages, what they call. And so from that they understand that uh, uh, all our assertions on all the linguistics philosophization that we're doing, linguistic analysis that we're doing, is true. It's fact. And then make arguments, and more philosophies are written based on that analysis, and narratives are built on that. Then you see this idea that zodiacal signs, zodiac, rashis come from the 12th division of space, comes from Greeks. Is absolutely ridiculous because 12 Adityas are, they say that zodiac itself comes from the Greeks. Bha chakra is an idea which is the real right word. Bha chakra, circle, chakra of light, of the ecliptic of the sun. That's the zodiac, and it's divided into 12. So the psychospatial divisions, the 30-degree divisions of the space, which has nothing to do with constellations, which is a false idea. It's a Greek idea because they call them planets. They zodiac means circle, zodiakos, which is a symbol, circle of animals, images, symbols of animal symbols. For us, it's Adityas, and it's 12 Adityas, and it has own internal logic. And Professor Ernst Willem is doing some profound research on this. Is probably the only one of the only best scholars that are alive on Jyotish right now. So Michio Yano's assertion that 12 zodiac signs were borrowed from Greek astronomy collapses under the weight of India's far older metaphysical framework. Concept of 12-fold divisions was already embedded in Vedic worldview through the 12 Adityas, solar deities governing each month of the year, long before any notion of the Greek zodiakos kaiklos, which means kiklos, or however you say it, circle of animals, appeared. That's because their idea, they were giving animal symbols, so they called it zodiac. The Indian Bhachakra, the wheel of light, predates Hellenistic constructs and is not a symbolic map of animal figures, but a solar temporal cycle rooted in the modulation of light and the rhythm of dharma. By ignoring this indigenous schema and superimposing a Greco-centric transmission narrative, Yano mistakes surface similarities for source, erasing the sophisticated cosmology and Shruti based structure of Jyotish. So, and we are actually, and the idea is because it's Aries, or so it's a ram, or it's a god of war. So that's how we got to know that the first psychospatial division, 30-degree division, which is literally what Rashi means, a heap of 30 degrees, is that's how we figured out that it's come on ruled by Kuja or Mars. No, 30 degrees is ruled by Mars, is a metaphysical idea. It's a metaphysical fact known to Jyotish. Whether all of these animals become extinct and after 20,000 years they recreate the Jyotish, the astrology, they would probably give a similar symbol to that first division. Probably someone, an animal that exists at that point that behaves like a ram, so that that energy of that 30 degrees can be expressed in an animal symbol, because they need symbols. We use a different idea. We use pancha mahabhutas. Mars is Agni. It's a certain pancha mahabhuta. There's a whole idea, philosophy, medicine. It's so sophisticated what we have, but they did not know that. Michio does not know that. Probably David, or if they know, they haven't gotten into it. Maybe, I don't know why, but that's what we have right now. And it is exactly this pattern that externalized Jyotish, turning it from a darshan into a museum exhibit. This isn't just a loss of nuance, it is a displacement of the center of meaning is distorted. That's why Jyotish has reached this degenerated state that we are in. Away from the practitioner, away from the sadhak, and into the hands of those who never practiced the discipline that they claim to explain. So we broke it too. This is important because now we have blamed and we have understood the why we are blaming. We have our logic. There is some utility to what the work that we have from Michio and all of these people, but we broke it too, and we're still breaking it right now. This is not only a story of external distortion. We must admit we have broken Jyotish from within. We stopped treating it as a discipline. We don't see it as a darshan, Shastra. We don't see it as like yoga, Sankhya. We see Jyotish as like this thing that astrology or these predict. People even put out their palm. You say, I'm a Jyotishi, and they put out their palm. Lal Kitab, one of these texts that is used by a lot of Vedic astrologers, half of that book is just palmistry. We became practitioners too quickly, which is wrong completely. We became practitioners too quickly, armed with a handful of techniques, a few modern books, and almost no grounding in the system's architecture. There's no discussion on the philosophy of Jyotish, no contemplation on the sutras. We bypassed Sanskrit. We don't want to learn Sanskrit, ignored the Shastra, avoided philosophical study, and rushed into prediction. That's what we want to do. We want to quickly do a course within 1 year. We want to start a business, make a couple of money every month, because it's simple. You just have to make meaning, and it's like tarot, and you just try to do intuitive download. You read a chart, and you're like, oh, Mars is like this. This is what's going to happen in your life. You want to like play around with words and give meaning of some sort to people. We don't want to study Sanskrit. We don't want to contemplate anything that's written, and the profundity and the amount of transformation, the self-awareness work that's required to become a Jyotishi, and the objective analysis that is required to engage with the system. We don't want to do that. The tradition that once demanded adhikar, tapas, and slow cultivation has now been reduced to quick access and client delivery. We wanted the authority of Jyotish without undergoing the transformation it requires, the pain, the crisis that you'll go through if you actually contemplate a sutra and you understand your chart and you realize your mistakes and the pap that you're living, so many papas that you, which is not a bad word. Pap means missing the sort of not in alignment with uh, prakriti is pap. We told ourselves that intuition could replace inquiry, that a remedy's effectiveness excused the absence of understanding, that alignment was enough and intellectual clarity is optional. Now, in this landscape of superficial learning, AI will accelerate this collapse because now you can work with unearned wisdom. You can write beautifully, but you cannot speak what you write. This will not happen by replacing us, but by mimicking us, by delivering interpretations without understanding, charts without context, results without realization. And a lot of astrologers are doing that, and they're making a mistake. The readings are wrong, everything is wrong, but they believe it's right because they haven't sort of done the work with the system. The system is itself philosophically broken right now, and AI will break it further if not guided by the right data and reasoning. If the right data is not given to it, because it's using all the stuff that is available all over the all the data on Jyotish, and it's using its reasoning model. It's a large language model using reasoning and making connections. But if all the available data is wrong, if what we have is from Michio, Yano, and David Pingree, and all the other works, then the conclusions will be wrong. Then you'll see third psychospatial division of Bha Chakra as Gemini, as the twins. But it has nothing to do with twins. It has something to do with Buddha, Mercury. It has something to do with number three. It has something to do with uh, what we have about third bhava. You can use Mithun, the word Mithun, and the idea of Mithun and what it means. And it has its own implications. It's not Gemini. Mithun is Mithun. And there's this another idea that uh, the Sanskritized names of the Greek words, like Mesha, is coming from Greeks. There's no evidence for that, other than Yavana Jataka. And maybe Yavana Jataka came to India, Yavaneshwara Sujitaja, and interacted with the people and took it back to the Greeks. It could be some a Greek came to India, someone from that part of the world, learnt with the rishis or the Jyotishis or whoever was available, wrote that text in Sanskrit and took it back. Maybe that's the case. An argument could be maybe made for that. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's not zero probability. It is a living system of inquiry, a method of for perceiving the architecture of karma as it unfolds in time. Colonialism decontextualized it. We, however, decommitted from it. The result is same, disconnection. We're disconnected from what Jyotish is. Until we are willing to return to the work of learning the language, Sanskrit, confronting the sutras, grappling with its metaphysics, and all the literature that it's connected to, which is a vast literature that Jyotish operates within. And we will continue to offer something that looks like Jyotish, but no longer is. So we have broken it too. Real scholars and real seers, when it comes to actual Jyotish, we find ourselves in a strange position. The field is dominated by two kinds of narrative builders. Western scholars trained in history and philology, writing from outside the system, like Pingree Yano, or modern content creators writing books and making predictions under the name of Vedic astrology. In between, there are very few who have approached Jyotish with reverence and rigor and a desire to make the system philosophically coherent and practically usable. Late Sri B.V. Raman is one of them, who brought Jyotish into the public discourse through his astrology magazine, and Carl Gustav Jung wrote a letter, and there was a brief correspondence between them. There are ideas I don't agree with. There are ideas which were in their nascent form, but the that's the giant, the shoulder. These are the giants on the shoulders whom which we are standing. So yeah, and then Sri K. N. Rao, and you cannot speak of Jyotish without mentioning Sri K. N. Raoji's name, who emphasized discipline, documentation, and a very serious, practical, scientific approach, not based in some sort of intuition and magic and all of these ideas, but technical, formulaic, mathematical, data-driven approach. And he's obviously another genius. B.V. Raman ji is a genius. K.N. Rao is a genius. Sri K.N. Rao. And then Sri Ernst Willem, who is an absolute genius, whose work, especially in Lajjatadi Avasthas, Ra Sutras, planetary yogas, core yogas, represents one of the most sincere efforts in modern times to recover the inner psychological logic of Jyotish from its source texts. He has done what few have dared to do: read the sutras slowly, deeply, and experientially. His translation of Jaimini Sutras or Upadesha Sutras of Rishi Jaimini are absolutely mind blowing. Sri Ansalam is a legend. He's I believe he's just absolutely profound. But even with these contributions, we still lack an indigenous contemplative sutra based scholarship that treats Jyotish not as a technique but as a darshan, a system of perception and self knowledge grounded in Shruti, sadhana, and subtle experience. And by indigenous, I don't mean uh, any racial or ethnicity based ideas. I believe an internal, local, native perspective, which Sri Ernst Willem has, and many other non Indian uh, practitioners have. So there's no encyclo, but even so now we see, but even with these contributions, we still lack an indigenous kind of sutra-based scholarship. And then we see there is no encyclopedia of Jyotish. There's no abridged versions of Parashara Hora, Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra. There are many versions, and if you say go to page 36, you need to understand which Jyotish text they're talking about. There's no like unified version of Parashara Hora, Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra. There are many versions, varying chapters, and different translation commentaries. There's no common language that we speak. There's no clear philosophy of Jyotish. There's no idea like what we are even trying to do here. The work of excavating, interpreting, and clarifying the original logic of Jyotish without distortion, without colonial filters, and without reducing it to prediction still lies ahead. And it must come from those who are both inside the tradition and afraid to question the inherited distortions. So we must question it, rebuild it, and bring real scholarship, real seeing, and as much effort as we can make. It's a long journey. It's not something that can be done overnight. The call for indigenous language and lived epistemology. If we are to reclaim Jyotish, the recovery must happen not just at the level of technique, but at the level of language, worldview, and lived practice, is what I mean by indigenous. We must stop trying to fit Jyotish into frameworks that were never designed to hold it. It is not Vedic astrology, it is not Greco Babylonian astronomy with Indian flavor. It is not a fortune telling system to be scientifically validated by double blind studies. We don't need any of this. It is a discipline of perception rooted in an entirely different epistemology, a way of knowing through lived experience, practice, reading charts, reading the system, understanding all the sutras, reading charts, and being like, oh, that makes sense. Oh, this is true. Like any internal arts, like meditation, like any sort of Tai Chi, Qigong, any kind of internal arts. You practice it and you're like, oh, there is something. Shruti, sadhana, and ontological inquiry. This means we must speak in its language, not just Sanskrit words, but metaphysical clarity, both. We need Sanskrit. We must stop translating away its precision. Words like graha, dasha, bhava, jnana, purushartha, these are not interchangeable with Western terms. We can use it for all practical purposes, but they need a discourse. The word graha can be used, okay, planet, but the word planet comes from planetis. It has its own etymology, meaning, and philosophy. Graha is graha and has to be used that way. You can use the word planet, but first understand the roots and orient your vision, uh, philosophical direction first is in the right angle, then you'll reach your destination. If it's vakri from the beginning, it's sort of a bit deviant, then you, after 500 kilometers, you'll reach a different island. This means we must speak in its language, not just Sanskrit words, but metaphysical clarity. We must stop translating away its precision. Words like graha, dasha, bhava, priyana, and purushartha are not interchangeable. We must learn by living it. Jyotish cannot be recovered through academic theory alone. It must be practiced, meditated upon, and wrestled with and surrendered to. And this will be the effort in this series, the Philosophy of Jyotish series. Of all these episodes will open up different philosophy of Jyotish basically. If the colonial gaze externalized Jyotish, then the only cure is re internalization. This gaze has nothing to do with nationality, ethnicity, or other such identifications. Jyotish has nothing to do with that. And that's a wrong way to approach it. It leads to exclusion and it leads to distortion, and that's not the purpose. We share the Jyoti, the sun is common to everyone. Jyotish believes in that there's one sun under which gives heat, light, and life to all of us. That's the Jyoti, that's Sarva Atma Divanat. It is rooted in a lack of understanding and acumen to engage in the subtle disciplines, but still wanting to engage with them and explain them away and catalog them. We need a generation of Jyotishis who become scholars, not scholars who theorize about Jyotishis. We need Jyotishis who become scholars and not scholars who talk and speak about Jyotishis. We need sutra readers, not spreadsheet modelers. We need those who understand that light is not a metaphor but an astral principle of consciousness that reveals the self within time. This is not romanticism, it is discipline, it is the return of Jyotish as a darshan, and the work begins now. So, I know this was a long lecture again, and I hope there is some sort of discussion that this particular episode that we can start a good discussion, internal discussion. First of all, internally you discuss with yourself, an idea has been planted, a certain way of thinking is uh, being proposed, a certain new kind of orientation towards Jyotish is being proposed. So I hope like we really understand that there is a serious lack of scholarship in Jyotish, and if we don't correct this, then it continues to degenerate. And I think we all love Jyotish way too much for it to go in this direction. So thank you so much for, if you're still here, you're very sincere. Thank you so much for being here for like so long and listening. And I hope you found something of value. And see you soon. Thank you so much.